The gunshot echoed through the Providence courthouse at 3:47 p.m., shattering the marble silence like a thunderclap. Judge Vincent Caprio felt the bullet whistle past his ear, embedding itself in the mahogany paneling behind his bench. Screams erupted from the gallery as bailiffs dove for cover, their radios crackling with desperate calls for backup. "Nobody moves." The gunman's voice cut through the chaos, raw with fury and desperation. Marcus Washington stood in the defendant's box, smoking revolver trembling in his weathered hands. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, locked onto Judge Caprio's steady gaze. 23 years I've been waiting for this moment, Your Honor. 23 years since you sent me to hell for a crime I didn't commit." The courtroom froze. Even the sobbing from the victim's family fell silent. This wasn't just another angry defendant. This was Marcus Washington, the man whose wrongful conviction had made headlines across America when DNA evidence finally set him free 6 months ago. The man who'd lost everything, his wife, his children, his entire life, to a system that had failed him catastrophically. Judge Caprio remained motionless in his chair, hands folded calmly on the bench. At 72 he'd presided over thousands of cases, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The weight of his own decisions, the lives he'd affected with the bang of his gavel, pressed down on his shoulders like a crushing avalanche. "Marcus," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "Put the gun down. Let's talk about this." "Talk." Marcus laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and broken. "You want to talk now? Where was all this talking when you sentenced me to life without parole? When you looked at me, a 25-year-old black man with no criminal record, and decided I was guilty before the trial even started?" The judge's mind raced back to that sweltering summer day in 1999. The murder of Rebecca Sullivan, a young white teacher found dead in her South Providence apartment. The pressure from the mayor's office, the media circus, the demand for swift justice. And Marcus Washington, a maintenance worker who'd been in the building that day, whose only crime had been being in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. The evidence seemed conclusive then, Judge Caprio said carefully. The eyewitness testimony, the circumstantial. "Lies," Marcus roared, the gun shaking violently. "That witness was a drug addict who got a plea deal for pointing the finger at me. The so-called circumstantial evidence was planted by dirty cops who needed a scapegoat. And you sat there in your black robes like some kind of god and decided my fate without caring about the truth." Detective Sarah Chin crouched behind an overturned table near the courtroom's side entrance, her service weapon drawn. She'd been testifying in an unrelated case when the shooting started. Now she watched the standoff unfold, her finger hovering over the trigger. One clean shot could end this, but something held her back. Maybe it was the pain in Marcus's voice, or the way Judge Caprio hadn't moved to protect himself. "You're right," the judge said suddenly, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "I failed you, Marcus. I failed the system and I failed justice itself." The admission hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Reporters in the gallery scrambled for their phones, while court officers looked on in shock. Judge Vincent Caprio, known for his unwavering confidence and stern demeanor, had just acknowledged what legal experts had been whispering for months, that the Washington case represented everything wrong with the American justice system. "Don't you dare try to psychoanalyze me now," Marcus snarled, but his voice cracked slightly. "You think saying sorry makes up for 23 years? You think admitting you screwed up brings back my wife who died while I was locked up? Or my daughter who grew up thinking her father was a killer?" Tears streamed down Marcus's face, mixing with the sweat that beaded his forehead. His finger tightened on the trigger as memories crashed over him. The prison fights, the endless appeals, the nights when he prayed to die rather than face another day behind bars for someone else's crime. Judge Caprio slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and calm. "You're absolutely right. Nothing I say can give you back what was stolen from you. But killing me won't bring them back either, Marcus. It'll only create more victims, more families destroyed by violence." The old judge stepped down from his bench, walking directly toward the armed man despite the frantic gestures from security personnel. Each step echoed in the deadly silence, a countdown that could end in either redemption or tragedy. "What are you doing?" Marcus whispered, the gun wavering as confusion replaced rage in his eyes. "What I should have done 23 years ago," Judge Caprio replied, now standing just 10 feet away from the barrel of the gun. "I'm choosing to see you as a human being instead of just another case number." The standoff stretched into its second hour as SWAT teams surrounded the courthouse and news helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. Inside, the tension had shifted from explosive panic to an eerie, suffocating calm. Marcus Washington still held the gun, but his arm had begun to tremble with exhaustion and emotional strain. Judge Caprio had pulled up a chair directly in front of the defendant's box, positioning himself in the most vulnerable spot possible. His bailiff, Tommy Martinez, had tried repeatedly to signal him back to safety, but the judge ignored every gesture. Instead, he sat facing the man whose life he'd helped destroy, unflinching under the weight of both the weapon and his own guilt. "Tell me about your daughter," the judge said softly. "What was her name?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Don't you dare try to manipulate me with that psychology garbage. I've had enough prison counselors try that trick. I'm not trying to manipulate you. I genuinely want to know about the family I helped tear apart." The silence stretched until Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Destiny. Her name was Destiny Marie Washington. She was 7 when you sent me away." His eyes grew distant, lost in memories. "Used to draw me pictures of us together, stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. She'd write, 'I love you, Daddy,' in crayon at the bottom." Detective Chin adjusted her position, her earpiece crackling with updates from the tactical team outside. The SWAT commander was growing impatient, pushing for authorization to take the shot. She could see Marcus clearly from her angle. One bullet to the center mass would end this immediately. But something about the conversation between the two men made her hesitate. "When I got arrested," Marcus continued, "Destiny was too young to understand. My wife Linda tried to explain that Daddy had to go away for a while, but she kept asking when I was coming home. Every visiting day for the first 3 years she'd show up with a new drawing. Always the same thing, stick figures of us together." Judge Caprio felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if someone had driven a spike directly through his heart. He remembered his own children at that age, the unconditional love in their eyes, the way they'd run to greet him when he came home from work. To imagine that being ripped away. "What happened to the visits?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Linda got remarried when Destiny was 12. Some accountant named Robert who adopted her and gave her his name. Linda said it would be easier if Destiny forgot about me, started fresh with a real father, who wasn't a convicted murderer." Marcus's voice cracked on the last words. The visit stopped. The letters stopped. "My own daughter grew up believing her biological father was a killer." The courtroom gallery had thinned as evacuation procedures moved civilians to safety, but a core group remained: journalists, court personnel, and family members of other defendants who'd been caught in the chaos. They listened in stunned silence as 23 years of anguish poured out of Marcus Washington. Dr. Amanda Foster, the court psychiatrist, had arrived 30 minutes earlier and positioned herself near the prosecution table. She'd handled hundreds of crisis interventions, but this situation defied every textbook scenario. The traditional de-escalation techniques seemed inadequate when facing such profound systemic injustice. "I tried to maintain contact through letters," Marcus went on, his free hand wiping tears from his face. "Wrote to Destiny every week for 15 years even after she stopped writing back. Told her about my appeals, about how I was fighting to prove my innocence, about how much I loved her. Never got a single response after age 13. Judge Caprio's own hands were shaking now. He thought about the hundreds of cases he'd presided over, the quick judgments, the reliance on prosecutorial presentations and police testimony. How many other Marcus Washingtons had sat in that defendant's box while he'd failed to look beyond the surface evidence? "The DNA results came back 6 months ago," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with anger. 6 months ago, the state finally admitted they'd sent an innocent man to prison for over 2 decades. You know what the prosecutor said at my exoneration hearing? The system worked. Justice was served. As if destroying my entire life was just a minor administrative error. Outside, news vans from every major network had set up a media circus on Federal Plaza. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all broadcasting live updates about the hostage situation involving a wrongfully convicted man and the judge who'd sentenced him. Social media exploded with debates about racial justice, wrongful convictions, and whether Marcus Washington was a victim or a terrorist. "I contacted Destiny after my release," Marcus continued. "She's 29 now, married, has 2 kids of her own. Lives in Seattle under her stepfather's name. When I called, she hung up on me. When I wrote, she returned the letters unopened. When I showed up at her house with the court documents proving my innocence, she called the police and got a restraining order." The judge closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the damage his decision had caused. Not just 23 years of Marcus's life, but generations of family destruction. Grandchildren who would never know their biological grandfather, a daughter who'd grown up ashamed of her father's memory. "So tell me, Your Honor," Marcus said, raising the gun slightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm on the formal title. "What's the appropriate sentence for stealing a man's entire existence? What's the punishment for judicial murder? Because that's what you did to me. You killed Marcus Washington as surely as if you'd put a bullet in my head." The words hung in the air like a death sentence of their own. Judge Caprio opened his eyes and looked directly into the barrel of the gun, seeing not just his potential death, but the reflection of every life he'd impacted from that bench. "You're right," he said simply. "And I'm ready to face whatever punishment you think is appropriate." The confession sent shockwaves through everyone in the courthouse. Even Marcus seemed taken aback by the judge's complete surrender to accountability. His finger loosened slightly on the trigger as he studied the older man's face, searching for deception or manipulation but finding only raw, honest regret. FBI negotiator agent Patricia Reeves had arrived from the Boston field office and was coordinating with local law enforcement outside. Through her earpiece, she could hear the entire conversation thanks to the courthouse's internal audio system. Everything about this situation violated standard hostage protocol. The judge was supposed to stay behind cover, maintain distance, avoid personal engagement with the subject. Instead, he was practically inviting Marcus to shoot him. "You don't understand," Marcus said, his voice wavering between rage and confusion. "I didn't come here for your apologies. I came here for justice. Real justice, not the fake courtroom kind that destroyed my life." "Then tell me what real justice looks like," Judge Caprio replied, leaning forward slightly. "What would it take to balance the scales?" Detective Chin watched from her concealed position, her training warring with her instincts. She'd studied the Marcus Washington case during her criminal justice courses at Providence College. The investigation had been sloppy from the start: witness coercion, evidence tampering, racial bias, prosecutorial misconduct. A textbook example of everything wrong with the system. But none of that justified holding a courtroom hostage. Marcus laughed bitterly. "Balance the scales? You want mathematical precision for human suffering? Okay, let's do the math. 23 years times 365 days times 24 hours. That's 201,480 hours of my life stolen. Every single hour filled with the knowledge that the world thought I was a rapist and killer. Every hour knowing my family was ashamed of me. Every hour watching actual criminals mock me for maintaining my innocence." The judge absorbed each word like a physical blow. He'd never considered the granular reality of a wrongful conviction, the daily, hourly torture of being caged for someone else's crime. His own worst days seemed trivial in comparison to such systematic destruction. "I got stabbed 14 times in prison," Marcus continued, pulling up his shirt to reveal a constellation of scars across his torso. "Because someone spread a rumor that I'd hurt a child. Had my ribs broken, my jaw wired shut, spent 3 months in solitary confinement for protection. All because you decided I looked guilty enough to satisfy the public's need for someone to blame." Dr. Foster scribbled notes on her pad, documenting the psychological profile of a man pushed far beyond normal human endurance. Marcus Washington wasn't just angry, he was psychologically shattered, his worldview completely demolished by institutional betrayal. The miracle wasn't that he'd snapped, it was that he'd maintained his sanity for as long as he had. "I lost more than time," Marcus said, his voice growing quieter but more intense. "I lost my identity. For 2 decades, I tried to figure out who I was, if not Destiny's father, if not Linda's husband, if not a free man living his own life. Prison doesn't just take your freedom, it erases you piece by piece until you're nothing but a number on a cell door." Judge Caprio thought about his own identity, built over 7 decades of family dinners, judicial achievements, community respect. To have all of that stripped away, to be reduced to nothing but the worst thing you'd allegedly done. The psychological destruction would be total. "When I got out, I tried to rebuild," Marcus continued. "But 23 years is a lifetime. Technology had changed, society had changed, everyone I'd known had moved on. I was like some prehistoric creature thawed out of ice, trying to function in a world that no longer had a place for me. The media circus outside had grown to massive proportions. Black Lives Matter activists were gathering alongside criminal justice reform advocates, while counter-protesters argued that Marcus Washington was just another criminal making excuses. The competing narratives played out on cable news in real time, with pundits debating whether this was a legitimate expression of rage against systemic racism or simply another act of violence that needed to be stopped with force. "I applied for over 200 jobs in 6 months," Marcus said. "Even with my exoneration paperwork, Even with lawyers explaining that I was innocent, nobody wanted to hire someone with a 23-year gap in their employment history. The few interviews I got, they'd look at me like I was contaminated, like wrongful conviction was contagious. Judge Caprio's phone buzzed with text messages from his wife, his children, colleagues, and friends, all begging him to get to safety, to stop engaging with the armed man. But he couldn't move. For the first time in his career, he was seeing the human cost of his judicial decisions with perfect clarity. "You want to know the worst part?" Marcus asked, tears streaming down his face again. "It's not the lost years or the physical pain or even losing my family. It's the knowledge that this happens every day in America. Right now, there are hundreds of innocent people sitting in cages because judges like you are too comfortable, too lazy, or too racist to demand real evidence instead of convenient stories." The words hit like bullets themselves. Judge Caprio realized that Marcus wasn't just seeking personal revenge. He was demanding accountability for an entire system of institutionalized injustice. This wasn't about one wrongful conviction. It was about a pattern of failures that destroyed lives while the perpetrators faced no consequences. "How many other Marcus Washingtons are there?" Marcus pressed, his voice rising. "How many other families torn apart by your gavel? How many other innocent people rotting in cells while you sleep peacefully in your comfortable bed?" The judge opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Because the terrible truth was that he didn't know. In 38 years on the bench, he'd never followed up on the lives he'd affected, never questioned whether justice had truly been served. He'd trusted the system, relied on prosecutors and police, and assumed that American justice was fundamentally sound. "I can't undo what I did to you," he finally said. "But I can use whatever time I have left to try to prevent it from happening to others." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, the gun still pointed at the judge's heart. "Time you have left?" he repeated slowly. "That sounds like you think you're walking out of here alive." The SWAT team had been in position for 3 hours and patience was running thin. Commander Jake Morrison studied the courthouse blueprints, calculating angles and entry points. He had 12 snipers with clear shots at Marcus Washington, but the judge's proximity to the target made any action extremely risky. The situation was becoming a public relations nightmare with every passing minute. Inside the courtroom, the psychological chess match continued. Marcus had allowed court personnel to bring water and had permitted several diabetic individuals in the gallery to take their medication, showing he wasn't completely beyond reason. But his grip on the weapon remained firm, and his emotional state seemed to fluctuate between profound sadness and explosive rage. "You keep talking about making amends," Marcus said, studying Judge Caprio's face for signs of deception. "But words are cheap. I've heard a lot of pretty speeches from politicians and prosecutors since my exoneration. Lots of head shaking and promises to do better. Meanwhile, the cops who framed me are still collecting pensions, and the prosecutor who built his career on my conviction is now running for state attorney general." The judge felt a chill run down his spine. He'd seen the news coverage of District Attorney Michael Brennan's gubernatorial campaign, watched him give speeches about being tough on crime, while never acknowledging his role in the Washington case. The same prosecutor who'd withheld exculpatory evidence, who'd coached witnesses, who'd painted Marcus as a monster to secure a conviction that would advance his political ambitions. "Brennan's going to be governor," Marcus continued, his voice filled with disgusted amazement. "The man who stole 23 years of my life is going to run the entire state. He's raising money right now on his record of putting dangerous criminals behind bars. Guess which case he highlights in his campaign ads?" Detective Chin shifted position slightly, her muscles cramping from maintaining the same crouch for hours. Through her earpiece, she could hear Agent Reeves coordinating with the tactical team, discussing acceptable losses and window of opportunity. The language of law enforcement reduced human lives to statistics and strategic considerations. But sitting in that courtroom listening to Marcus's story, she found herself questioning everything she'd believed about justice. "I've been watching his campaign rallies online," Marcus said, pulling out his phone with his free hand and scrolling through video clips. "Listen to this." He pressed play on a campaign ad and Michael Brennan's confident voice filled the courtroom. "As your district attorney, I've never backed down from the tough cases. When Rebecca Sullivan was brutally murdered, I made sure her killer faced justice. That's the kind of leadership Massachusetts needs, someone who stands up for victims and their families." The ad continued with testimonials from law enforcement officers praising Brennan's commitment to public safety, interspersed with photos of him at press conferences announcing major convictions. Marcus's case featured prominently, with file footage of Brennan declaring that justice has been served after the guilty verdict. "23 years later, he's still fundraising off my wrongful conviction," Marcus said, his voice thick with disgust. "Still using Rebecca Sullivan's death to advance his career, even though he knows I didn't kill her. Even though the real killer, a serial rapist named David Torres, confessed before he died in a Florida prison last year." Judge Caprio felt physically sick. He remembered the political pressure surrounding the Sullivan case, the way Brennan had positioned himself as the defender of public safety. The judge had been complicit in that narrative, allowing his courtroom to become a theater for prosecutorial ambition rather than a forum for truth. Dr. Foster had been studying Marcus's behavioral patterns, noting the way his agitation spiked whenever he discussed the ongoing injustices. His anger wasn't just about the past, it was about the present continuation of the same corrupt system that had destroyed his life. This wasn't a man seeking closure. This was someone watching his tormentors profit from their crimes while he struggled to rebuild from nothing. "You know what the final insult was?" Marcus asked, his finger tightening on the trigger again. "The state offered me compensation for the wrongful conviction. Guess how much? $50,000 per year for 23 years. Sounds generous, right? Except they deducted the cost of my room and board in prison. Literally charged me rent for the privilege of being caged for someone else's crime." The mathematics of institutional cruelty were staggering. Judge Caprio calculated the deductions: food, housing, medical care, all the basic necessities that free citizens took for granted, treated as services that Marcus should be grateful to have received. After legal fees and taxes, he'd probably netted less than $20,000 per year of stolen life. "So I'm supposed to be satisfied with that check and disappear quietly," Marcus continued. "Accept my payment for services rendered to the criminal justice system and never mention how it destroyed everything I cared about. Move to some small town where nobody knows my history and pretend the last quarter century never happened." Outside, the media narrative was beginning to shift as details of the Washington case spread across social media. Legal experts were dissecting the original trial, highlighting the obvious problems with the investigation and prosecution. Civil rights organizations were calling for congressional hearings on prosecutorial misconduct, while conservative commentators argued that Marcus's current actions proved he belonged in prison after all. "I tried to be the good victim," Marcus said, his voice growing harder. "Gave interviews about forgiveness and redemption, talked about how I wasn't bitter, how I wanted to help reform the system. You know what happened? People got bored with my story after about 2 weeks. The news cycle moved on, the politicians stopped returning my calls, and the system went right back to destroying other innocent lives." Judge Caprio realized that Marcus wasn't just holding him hostage. He was holding the entire justice system accountable through the most dramatic means possible. Every news camera outside, every social media post, every political pundit forced to address the case, was amplifying a conversation about wrongful convictions that otherwise would have been forgotten. "This is the only way anyone pays attention," Marcus said, as if reading the judge's thoughts. 23 years of trying to work within the system and nobody cared. 4 hours with a gun in my hand, and suddenly the whole world wants to hear my story." The terrible logic was undeniable. Marcus had exhausted every legal remedy, every peaceful avenue for justice. His compensation claim had been minimized, his attempts at reform had been ignored, and the people who destroyed his life were thriving in their careers. Violence was the last resort of the completely powerless. "So here's my ultimatum," Marcus said, standing up in the defendant's box for the first time since the standoff began. "You're going to use whatever influence you have left to make sure Michael Brennan never becomes governor. You're going to publicly detail every wrongful conviction case that came through your courtroom. And you're going to dedicate the rest of your life to tearing down the system that made both of us into monsters." The gun was now pointed directly at Judge Caprio's forehead, the barrel steady despite Marcus's emotional state. "Or I'm going to end your life right here, right now, and make you a symbol of judicial accountability whether you want to be or not." The ultimatum hung in the air like a death sentence, its weight pressing down on everyone in the courtroom. Judge Caprio stared into the black eye of the gun barrel, knowing that his next words would determine not just his own fate, but the legacy of everything he'd built over nearly 4 decades on the bench. Outside, the media circus had reached fever pitch. News helicopters circled overhead while reporters broadcast live updates to a nation transfixed by the unfolding drama. Social media exploded with hashtags: hashtag Marcus Washington, hashtag wrongful conviction, hashtag judicial accountability, as millions of people debated whether they were witnessing justice or terrorism. "You're asking me to destroy my entire career," Judge Caprio said quietly, his voice steady despite the weapon aimed at his skull. To admit that I've been complicit in a fundamentally corrupt system. I'm asking you to tell the truth, Marcus replied, his finger hovering over the trigger. Something you should have done 23 years ago. Detective Chin felt sweat dripping down her back as she maintained her position. Through her earpiece, she could hear SWAT Commander Morrison growing increasingly agitated, demanding authorization for lethal force. The situation had gone on too long, attracted too much attention, become too politically charged for a clean resolution. Washington's clearly unstable, Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. We need to end this before he starts shooting civilians. But Agent Reeves hesitated. Something about this confrontation felt different from typical hostage situations. Marcus Washington wasn't making impossible demands or seeking personal gain. He was demanding accountability from a system that had failed him catastrophically, using the only leverage he had left. Judge Caprio closed his eyes and thought about his legacy. 3 decades of judicial service, thousands of cases, a reputation for fairness and wisdom that had earned him respect throughout the legal community. To admit that it had all been built on a foundation of institutional racism and prosecutorial misconduct would destroy everything he'd worked for. But then he opened his eyes and looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw not a dangerous criminal but a broken man who'd been ground to dust by the machinery of American justice. A man whose only crime had been existing in the wrong place with the wrong skin color when the system needed someone to blame. How many others are there? The judge asked suddenly. How many Marcus Washingtons have I helped create? I've been researching your cases since my release, Marcus replied, never wavering in his aim. 47 African-American defendants sentenced to life imprisonment or death row during your tenure. All based on questionable evidence, coerced confessions, or prosecutorial misconduct. Want to guess how many have been exonerated so far? The number hit Judge Caprio like a physical blow. He'd always prided himself on being colorblind in his judgments, on treating all defendants equally under the law. But the statistics didn't lie. His courtroom had been a killing field for black and brown bodies, a conveyor belt feeding the prison industrial complex. 3, Marcus continued. 3 besides me have been proven innocent through DNA evidence or prosecutorial admissions. 3 families destroyed, 3 lives stolen, 3 men who lost decades to your gavel. And those are just the ones where the truth finally came out. How many others are still rotting in cages for crimes they didn't commit? Dr. Foster scribbled frantically in her notebook, documenting what was essentially a real-time confession of systemic judicial failure. The psychological profile she was witnessing defied every category. This wasn't just individual trauma but collective institutional damage that had poisoned an entire community's relationship with justice. You know what the real tragedy is? Marcus asked, tears streaming down his face again. I still believe in justice. After everything that's happened, I still think the system could work if people like you had the courage to demand real evidence instead of convenient narratives. Judge Caprio felt something break inside his chest, not his heart but something deeper. The comfortable mythology he'd built around his career, the belief that he'd been serving justice rather than simply processing cases through an assembly line of conviction. The recognition that his legacy was written in the destroyed lives of innocent people. I'll do it, he said quietly. I'll expose every case, challenge every conviction, and use whatever time I have left to try to repair the damage I've helped cause. Marcus studied his face intently, searching for deception or manipulation. You're just trying to save your own life. Maybe, the judge admitted. But even if I am, the result would be the same. 47 cases reopened, 47 families given hope, 47 chances to find the truth I should have demanded in the first place. The gun trembled in Marcus's hands as he wrestled with a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could pull the trigger, make Judge Caprio a martyr for judicial reform, and likely die in the ensuing gunfire. Or he could trust a system that had already betrayed him once, hoping that this time would be different. If you're lying to me, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, if you walk out of here and go back to business as usual, I will find you. I will expose every detail of your corruption, and I will make sure the whole world knows what kind of man you really are. I understand, Judge Caprio replied. And you have every right to hold me accountable. The silence stretched for an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of helicopters and the muffled voices of the tactical teams outside. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath, knowing they were witnessing either the beginning of real reform or the final act of a tragedy that had been building for 23 years. Finally, Marcus Washington lowered the gun. Don't make me regret this, he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and grief. Judge Caprio stood up slowly, his legs shaking from hours of tension. I won't. I promise you, Marcus, I won't waste this second chance. The SWAT team burst through the doors within seconds, weapons drawn, shouting commands as Marcus dropped the gun and raised his hands. Detective Chin emerged from her hiding spot, her own weapon holstered, watching as they tackled the man who'd just given up his only leverage on faith alone. As the tactical officers secured the scene, Judge Caprio walked over to where Marcus was being handcuffed. Despite the chaos around them, their eyes met one final time. "Thank you," the judge said simply, "for showing me what justice really means." Marcus nodded once before being led away, leaving Judge Caprio alone with the weight of his promise and the knowledge that his real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Judge Vincent Caprio had become the most controversial figure in American jurisprudence. His systematic review of 47 cases had resulted in 12 additional exonerations, 3 retrials, and a federal investigation into prosecutorial misconduct in Massachusetts. Michael Brennan had withdrawn from the gubernatorial race after corruption charges were filed, and the courthouse where it all began had been renamed the Marcus Washington Center for Judicial Reform. Marcus himself had been sentenced to 5 years for the courthouse incident but was released after 18 months for good behavior and his cooperation with the Reform Commission. He now worked alongside Judge Caprio, reviewing wrongful conviction cases and advocating for criminal justice reform. They never became friends, the wound was too deep, the damage too profound. But they'd found something more valuable than friendship: a shared commitment to ensuring that no other family would suffer what Marcus Washington had endured. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it's about having the courage to admit when the system has failed, and the determination to build something better from the ruins of what came before. In the end, Judge Caprio chose humanity over self-preservation, and Marcus Washington chose hope over vengeance. Together, they proved that even the most broken system could be reformed when people were willing to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The black lives that had been on trial in that courthouse weren't just Marcus Washington's. They were everyone who'd ever been failed by a justice system that valued convictions over truth. And in choosing to face that failure honestly, both men had helped ensure that those lives would finally matter in the eyes of the law.